To it, where the Ukraine war goes next. As always, we begin with this quick fire round, 30 seconds each to out your initial stance, and we'll pick up the conversation right after. So, Amir Oren, please take the lead.
So it's a bit presumptuous of us to try to predict the future, because
but we're
one of the
presumptuous
sides,
people.
Yes, but one of them may land a blow on the other side's chin and change it. But short of that, we are in for a long stalemate, and the operational gains on either side are not going to gain this side any strategic value.
Stanislav Rybachuk, your thoughts?
I kind of feel similar, but maybe I'm still expecting a potential hit of either of the armies. So Russia trying to attack somewhere unpredictable, although I have no idea where it might be, or Ukraine trying to run another operation like was run in Kharkiv with the help of all of the weapons that were already supplied to us. So kind of preparing another steel hammer to attack.
Last but not least, Mr. Tom Gross, your take?
Yes, well, I'll differ slightly and say that I'm disappointed there isn't more talk of possible resolution or ceasefire. That's not because I think that Russia should gain anything, but it's because this war's only in its first year, and it could get much, much worse, as horrible as it's been. If one thinks in World War II, just in a couple of nights, I think 25,000 people were killed in Dresden, I think 180,000 injured and 37,000 killed in Hamburg. And I like to see some sort of end game, not just tactical battle by battle.
Never underestimate the potential of new lows you're suggesting. And gentlemen, from this point onwards, let's feel free to interact. And let me put it simply. Did the warm winter simply ruin it for Putin, Tom?
Well, yes, it hasn't helped. And obviously, this war has been a disaster and a terrible strategic mistake by Putin. Nevertheless, I can't see him and his regime easily giving in. And they have a lot more fight in them. And as horrible as it's been, as I just said, they've got much more weaponry that they could still use. So, you know, Russia's not going to go away. I'm not quite sure what the war aims realistically can be, especially since I'm afraid America and Britain, while supporting Ukraine right now, we know if we look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Vietnam and the like, at some point America gets bored, leaves and leaves those countries in an utter mess that we see with Libya, for example, now. Yeah. So sorry to bring this bad news to the Ukrainian friends, but they should also prepare for the fact that it might not be unlimited support from the West.
Stanislav, you're listening to Tom Gross. Here is Ukraine's end, not the U.S.'s end?
I understand the point, but I don't think that Ukraine being almost in the middle of Europe is anywhere close to Libya or any other countries, not to, despite those countries in any way. But I feel that American loss within Ukraine or visible unsupport would be devastating to any kind of NATO, let's call it popularity worldwide, especially given the tensions with China. So I do not agree that maybe not as much support as Ukraine needs will be received, but I do not believe that it's going to go anywhere, below what we are at right now.
Okay, we will be talking more on the Western support or lack thereof later on in the second part of our conversation, but I do want to circle back to Moscow. Amir Oren, the Kremlin top commander shake-up. How surprised should we be, really? And perhaps most importantly, will it have any real impact on the fighting?
So it's a very desperate move on the part of Putin. It's like in World War II, General Marshall being moved from Washington to supervise General Eisenhower because the D-Day landings have failed. And the reason Gerasimov did not succeed out of Moscow, but was sent to the front, is that Gerasimov's doctrine was not so overt. He was for a hybrid sort of war, clandestine, subversive, not so much kinetic. And the Russians have not managed to win the very first fight of the war, what they essentially wanted was to install in Kiev a sort of Lushchenko in Belarus. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to win without a fight. They failed, and the commanders could not organize the forces in a very efficient manner. So Gerasimov is almost the last card, the last wild card that Putin can put on the table from a personnel point of view.
And you've mentioned Belarus, and as we speak, Russia begins a joint military exercise, plural, with Belarus. Ukraine is said to be preparing to launch some sort of an attack near the border with Belarus. Will it change the war, or simply another war front, Stanislav?
Yes, exactly. Another war front. We have news about Belarus going on for another 4 or 5 months now. It's been constantly used as one of the reasons for Ukrainians to hold seemingly large forces on the north, for them not to be moved to the east, where Russia is trying to do something. Back to the previous question, I do believe that Russia has pretty clear sights of how this war should go. They should take Donbass, the full of it, so Donetsk and Lugansk region fully, then claim that they have liberated Donbass, and everything else was done, for the sake of demilitarization, or whatever Putin calls it.
Yeah.
And I also think that Putin right now is mostly centralized against how to take the blame away from him. So whatever it is, Prigozhin, Russian army, any kind of generals, it doesn't matter as long as someone dies, but not him.
And Tom Gross, you alluded to that earlier, if I was understanding you correctly, and if not, I will still ask the following. Should the West change its working assumption, its thinking? Should it ditch the notion of ditching Putin if we're talking about a potential peace of some sort?
Well, I think we would all love a world in which Putin was gone and he was replaced by a democratic, liberal, friendly, internationally cooperative Russian leader. The problem I see is that if Putin goes, and it's a big if, there is a bigger chance that someone worse, someone more hardline, someone more dictatorial, someone who might consider to even use tactical nuclear weapons might come in. Russia does not have a history of democracy. Even in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland and Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria are struggling to make liberal democracies 34 years after the end of communism. So if Putin goes, my question is, what next? I'm all for Putin going, but I'm not quite clear that Russia will suddenly become a more friendly country. And unfortunately, it's a massive country. It has the world's biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons, about 6,000. We don't want someone worse than Putin, but we also don't want Russia to break up and be ungovernable like Libya is today. Remember, Britain and France essentially helped break Libya, and until today, Libya is chaotic. And although Stanislav mentioned earlier, and he's right, that Libya is not in the heart of Europe, nevertheless, because the border in Libya is now open, you have millions of people from Africa trying to reach Europe. And as a result, you have kind of quasi-fascistic governments being elected in Italy and Sweden. So Libya does have consequences for Europe. And with Russia, if it was to break up, there are dozens, maybe hundreds of possibly breakaway separatist regions from, Dagestan and the like. Yeah. And with all those nuclear weapons on the loose, we've got to be very, very careful about what we wish for in getting rid of Putin. We have to have a very clear plan B if he goes.
So, Amir Oren, instead of trying to get Putin out of the equation, maybe the equation should include Putin?
Well, if one goes back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and they had a 10-year involvement there, you had 4 leaders succeeding each other. You had Brezhnev, you had Andropov, you had Chernenko, and then you had Gorbachev, who finally extricated the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan because they had a sort of collective leadership with a Politburo. Now, Putin rules almost, and perhaps not even almost, personally. And if Putin goes, I do believe that the Russians will find a pretext to claim that whatever partial gains they made are sufficient to them, and that they can call it a truce at least.
And Stanislav, before we wrap up the first part of our conversation here, let's talk Soledar. What would a Russian capture of it mean for the war? Lack of a capture, how will it impact the greater scheme of things?
I am not specifically a military specialist, so I will not be claiming to have truth here. But to the best of my knowledge, and just observing the field, let's call it that way. One of my best friends was fighting there also. The city itself, nor anything around it, has any kind of strategical value. What it does have is being one of another, strongholds within the Donetsk region, within Donbas, that Putin claimed to be, the milestone of war from the very beginning. So I do believe that this is just one additional step for Putin to claim a intermediary victory. Sorry for running out of time.
Okay, Amir Oren, perhaps you can clarify what are we waiting for?
So we are waiting for a sort of a Kissinger who will come up with a formula clever enough to satisfy both Putin and Zelensky, who could declare that the sacrifice was worthwhile, or else what we could have is a sort of what happened with the Israeli Defense Forces versus the Egyptian army in the 1973 war, when the Third Army was encircled or was about to be destroyed. If one of the sides manages such a ploy, the other one will have to agree to any terms for a ceasefire.
Okay, and we'll dive in further into that right after the break. Tom Gross, Stanislav Rybachuk, and Amir Oren, you're staying with us. A short break, and we're back with our summit, so do not go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Stanislav Rybachuk, Tom Gross, and Amir Oren. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for staying with us. And before we dive back into our conversation, the Challenger followed the Patriot. After air comes land. Let's take a listen to the NATO chief talking about military aid.
The aim is, of course, to ensure that we can continue and also strengthen our support to Ukraine, because we have seen that Russia has suffered big losses in Ukraine due to the brave Ukrainian soldiers and the professionalism and the dedication of the Ukrainian armed forces. But we should not underestimate Russia. They are mobilizing more troops. They are working hard to acquire more equipment, more ammunition, and they have shown a willingness to actually suffer, but to continue the war. And there is no indication that President Putin has changed the overall aim of his brutal war against Ukraine. So we need to be prepared for the long haul.
So let's get to it. Done boosting Ukrainian air defense. The West is sending in some tanks. Why now? Once again, we begin with the quick fire 30-second round, and we pick it up from there. Stanislav Rybachuk, please take the lead.
I believe that Russia is getting those 200,000 troops prepared. Approximately somewhere by the end of February. So I guess the West is ensuring that Ukraine can at least defend those lands that are already freed. The best case scenario for Ukraine is that we can, assume another operation like we had within Kharkiv, but that is yet unclear whether we are ready to do so with the existing equipment.
Tom Gross?
Yes, again, just to expand on what I said, of course, I would love for Russia to withdraw from all occupied Ukrainian territory, and indeed from occupied territory it has from various other nations too. But the reality is that it may suit Western arms manufacturers and so on to talk about going on for years. I'm just a bit worried that this war could go on for several years and then we'd still get a stalemate of roughly the kind we have now, and things could get worse for Ukraine politically. For example, there there could be a new president in America like DeSantis and a more Republican Congress, which is less keen on arming Ukraine. You could have Elon Musk stopping supplying, satellite jamming and so on.
Okay, Amir Oren?
By supplying armor, these 300 tanks, which is roughly an armored division, the Americans cannot help the Ukrainians defeat Russia, but they can help it avoid defeat because the defender has an advantage. Usually it is considered 3-1 against the offense. So the war can go on, an attrition war, and the Russians will have to reconsider.
But Amir, you were listening to what Tom Gross just suggested, that Ukraine is becoming a testbed for Western weapons. Is that so?
No, this is, while not really a conspiracy theory, this is a skeptical view of the motives of the Biden administration. Let's give more credit to this particular administration, not to the previous one, and hopefully not to the next one. They are really keen on coming to an end in Europe in this conflict and focusing on China.
By the way, I wasn't suggesting they don't care about liberating territory. It is wrong morally and strategically to allow a country like Russia to conquer parts of a neighboring country. What I'm worried about is the reality, economic reality setting in. You have voices on the American right already saying that no one's protecting the American southern border with Mexico, or that not enough's being spent on infrastructure in America and more is being spent on Ukraine. I'm just saying there may be increasing voices like this, and there may not be an open-ended support for Ukraine, and Ukraine may strategically be in a rather good position now, having had some battlefield victories, to maybe try and negotiate from a position of strength. Maybe, I don't know, Putin, who's had a disastrous war, may also wish to have an opt-out at this point. And my cynicism is that there's certain people in Washington that want to bleed Russia as much as possible, and they're quite content with this war going on, with Ukrainians doing the fighting for them. They don't know Americans have to die. And I am worried that Ukrainians in the end won't get much of a better deal than they might get if they negotiate now, only that there'll be hundreds of thousands more dead and injured and refugees by the time we get there after several years.
Stanislav Rybachuk, I'm always perplexed whether it's cashing in or cashing out. I'm not a poker player, but is Tom Gross right? Maybe this is a time to end it from Kyiv's standpoint?
I was trying my best not to interrupt because, of course, it makes sense, and I understand the point, but living in Ukraine, you would understand that it's impossible for the Ukrainian people right now. So if Zelensky even wanted to do so, and I'm quite sure he doesn't, there would be a riot or whatever you call it, Maidan, claiming that we are to continue, because the number of casualties taken by Ukraine, be it in infrastructure, civilian population, every human being here has at least one friend or family who has suffered or died during this war. So as of now, any kind of ceasefire just because someone is tired or the West is not ready to supply further, even though it does make sense, whatever you're saying, but it does make sense from the Capitol Hill, as you said. Within Ukraine, we would be rather looking for another opportunity. This is my position, not specifically as a Ukrainian, but just seeing within Kiev, within the central regions and within the western regions, how people are thinking of the war. And just one sentence with President Putin, I do not believe that he can attain not winning in Ukraine, because his whole career was building another Russian empire, which is impossible without Ukraine as a mythical center, because of Kiev as the motherland of all of the Russian cities, as you know. So I guess those two diagonally different entities do not coincide in any way unless we find a new solution, which I just do not see right now. So
what is, or is there any peacemaking formula here, perhaps changing, as Stanislav is saying, Russia really needs to win, Ukraine cannot afford to lose, maybe changing the definitions of what would qualify as a win or loss, Amir?
Yes, that's exactly it. Defining war aims and therefore whether any party has achieved this war aim or in more popular terms, victory. Yes, this is the crux of the matter, and it can be achieved if the Russians are now going to portray whatever the agreement will be, however the war will end, as putting an end to the threat from the West. If Ukraine becomes a buffer state between NATO and Russia, it may be enough for them. If, on the other hand, for Ukraine, the end of the Russian threat from the East is achieved somehow, then that may barely justify the sacrifices, which are huge, both military and civilian.
And Tom Gross, I do want to circle back for a sec to the issue of Western military aid. In the little time we have left, why is Germany so hesitant to chime in? Can it put a spoke in NATO's wheels?
Well, yeah, obviously, from Ukraine's point of view, it would be much better if Germany and France and others were as keen as the United States and the United Kingdom are. I don't know enough about internal German political reasons, but I can speculate that in the post-war era, Germany, for obvious historical reasons, is very reluctant to be involved militarily, even in supplying weapons. And there's that sense of post-Nazi pacifism that runs through Germany. With France, I believe they have historic connections and ties with Russia going back centuries. And it's maybe also, they're maybe also more worried. They're closer to Russia, whereas it's easy for America and Britain to be a little bit gung-ho. They have a distance from Russia. But again, I'm not an expert on Germany. That's just speculation by me.
Yes, and we will
But Ellie, you know, it's not a matter of policy as much as very, very small stocks that they have. The armies have depleted their war stocks, and they are going to be left with next to nothing.
Well, we'll be waiting for the winter stalemate to end. Amir Oren, Stanislav Rybachuk, and Tom Gross, thank you very much for this 2-minute break, and we're back.